Hello, world. It is Monday, April 9th, 2018. There is a considerable gap on this episode 4 of Make Politics Positive from Make Politics Positive episode 3. It's been months. I don't know how many months. Stephen, what's changed for you in the last several months?
I live in Kansas City now. I've gotten into pattern shirts, so that's kind of new.
Ooh,
There's
ooh.
there's a lot of change happening.
Yeah,
Um, and I think the last episode was 2017. Is that correct, or do we do one 2018?
I don't, you know, we've still real, I'm reeling from the success. It's hard to remember. We've been living life in the fast lane since we got the 35 views on our last video.
I just want to say Happy New Year to anyone who maybe didn't hear that
They've been
since.
waiting for that, Stephen. They've been waiting for you.
Now their year can start. It's good.
Stephen, you are not wearing a bomber jacket, so I don't feel like you're officially a Kansas City resident yet.
I've been looking for one. Turns out that they're actually quite challenging to find.
Interesting. I don't know
Yeah,
if you and I come to Portland. They line the streets here. You get one just walking down the road.
that and like a leather jacket, I'd imagine.
If with fringe, yeah,
Yeah,
only
yeah,
with
yeah.
fringe.
Of
Yeah,
course.
it
Yeah.
has to look like you are like about to hop in a VW van and drive down the road while reading John Kerouac.
Which is the
Jack
look that
Kerouac.
I'm starting to go for.
What's that?
So I said that's kind of the look I want to go for with this new chapter in my
Yeah,
life.
New Year, New You here in
That's right.
April. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
On that note, it has been a lot of things have happened since last we talked. As a reminder, if this is your first time listening to Make Politics Positive, the premise of the show, Curtis Haley, am a tofu eating progressive. Stephen, how would you describe yourself?
I think in the first episode I said Romneytarian, but I mean I'm a conservative who is not like a Trump conservative, but more of a centrist, right-leaning human.
I'm sure Donald Trump would have a lot of opinions about that. But the moral of the story is he's conservative. I'm liberal. For whatever labels that might be for you, that's sort of the end of the spectrums that we're on. And we are here to have what doesn't exist in the world, a civil conversation about a hot button issue where we calmly and rationally explain what we think and do it in a way that hopefully will help you understand what people on the other side of the issue think. And we have not killed each other yet. Few close calls, but our friendship survives. So Make Politics Positive has 5 core values. The idea, the ethos behind it. Politics can be positive, not just angry. It can be accessible, not confusing. It can be authentic, not fake. It can be empowering, meaning people should want to get involved, and it can be fun. And both of us were just talking about how it's a travesty that we have not done this more because this is fun. This is what we think is fun, which is sad in some respects. So we're talking about 2A, the Second Amendment. A few hundred years ago, the founding fathers of this country all sat together at what I assume was a fine wooden table and said, let's write the most confusing possible amendment to this Constitution. I forget being clear. Let's talk about well-regulated militias. Let's talk about the right to bear arms. Let's not define any of these things. I'm sure people in the future will have an easy time figuring it out. And boy, haven't we. So we're talking about gun rights. Stephen, how many guns do you own?
I don't know if we publicly say that, but no, my family has a bunch of, not a bunch of that. Sounds like we have a
A
cabinet or some
compound
sort.
full of guns.
No, I mean we have a shotgun and a not an AR, but kind of a similar semi-automatic rifle, and a couple of handguns. And so um, I wasn't necessarily a lot of people who were raised shooting guns. I wasn't, but I've learned how to shoot them, and I've been at the range a couple of times with both the rifles and the handguns. So we have a few, not a lot.
Yeah, that is more than the zero that I have, and this is good because I want to give people as much ammunition, pun intended, to break down any arguments I have about this. I do not own a gun. I have never shot a gun. I have never touched a gun. I have never been in the room with a gun that is not physically on a police officer at that moment, except for maybe my dad's hunting rifle the time I found it in the back of the closet, which hashtag gun safety is not the best place to put your hunting rifle. But it's okay. I was 8, so I knew not to touch that. But I will say that I am generally, as far as liberal people go, probably less anti-gun than most people. I think of myself that way. My fiance right now is in the final stages of applying to be a member of the Portland Police Bureau. They still issue guns to to police officers. And so we will most likely, if that all comes to fruition, have a gun living right here in the house with us. So all to say, we're going to talk about 2A. So Stephen, you are the resident. You clearly have a lot more experience with firearms than I do. What's your, in light of everything that's happened this year, of all the conversations we've had, what's sort of your big picture conservative take on Second Amendment? What do all of the thriving masses that make up our audience, what do they need to know about your views on this issue?
Um, I, it's interesting that you've framed it as one of the more, I guess, confusing amendments. Um, I think that the well-regulated part obviously is up for debate about what that means. But I think generally people have a right to own weapons for self-defense, for recreation, whether that recreation is hunting or whether they just like to go to the range and make loud noises. Because that latter part is my family. We just go to the range and shoot zombie targets for the fun of it. It's not for hunting. And thankfully, we haven't had to use a weapon for self-defense. And so I think that anyone who's going to be in contact with a weapon obviously needs to be very highly trained, there needs to be an um, extensive, whether it's a background check or process to go through obtaining one. I am not like most libertarians who would say, how we've said like, oh, we've banned grenades and fully automatic weapons, and we shouldn't. We should have all weapons accessible. I don't think that should be the case. I do believe in some regulations, albeit probably not as many as you, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, I believe that people should have a right to own a weapon for whatever of those purposes we talked about. Um, and this year has opened up my mind to some of the solutions that have been brought forward after Parkland. Many of them are not related to the gun as much as they are the process of getting the gun, what goes onto a gun or what goes into a gun. So one of the things that came up after the Las Vegas shooting was the bump stock ban. I I don't see how that would violate the Second Amendment. You're not taking away someone's right to own a gun. You're simply regulating an accessory that goes onto one to make it more effective at killing. Also, background checks, which should be universal, and I think even for private cells, although that's harder to enforce and regulate, I think that needs to happen. The age requirements is an interesting one. Um, I'm not quite as sure that the rifle should go up to 21, but it's a conversation that I think we should have, and especially maybe something like an AR or a semi-automatic weapon should be. Um, and then the other thing that I think is really interesting is um, the as we saw with Parkland, a lot of the problems were not that gun laws, were not in place, but that the gun laws that were in place were not enforced, and that the police did not do their job, the authorities did not do their job correctly, which is often the case in these mass shooting situations. And so I think we have to look at kind of holistically what all besides just the machine, the gun, goes into some of these horrific occurrences.
Let me ask you something. This why obviously we can agree about like what rights exist under the Second Amendment. That's there have been lots of court cases about that. Why do you think that it is important for people to be able to have guns? Like, what's the importance of that right? Is it just that government shouldn't tell me what bang bangs I can use, or is there, like, in your mind, what sort of the philosophical reason why people should, if the second, if the Second Amendment were to go away, why do you feel like in a just society people should feel like they have firearms?
Well, I think number one, what we see with these situations, that first responders are not actually the first responders. Whether it's a home invasion or a mass shooting situation, um, like the case that happened in Texas, it was a person, a citizen with a gun who stopped that shooter. Oftentimes, the authorities are the second responders in these situations, and so I think defense of yourself and the people around you is probably my strongest point of it. The second point of it is I take this from history of what the founders were dealing with at the time. And this is going to get into dicey territory because some people will take this and kind of put it out of proportion. But in our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, we talk about when a government becomes tyrannical, we have the right to get rid of it, establish a new one. I certainly believe that that's the case. And there's been a lot of renewed conversation about that recently with President Trump, although I think that's a bit extreme. But nonetheless, the idea that the government can become out of control, and that citizens will need to take an action against it, and this is where it starts to get dicey. I think the Second Amendment can be used if the time were, if unfortunately were to come, to resist a government that slipped into a tyrannical sort of setting.
Which is an interesting, like, it's all people when they talk about things, like, they like to use bumper sticker phrases like Second Amendment solutions, and it's like I think that a big part of the gun debate that's sort of interesting is that people like to use euphemisms and not just talk plainly about what that means. And I know what you're talking about, it being dicey, because when you say that, what you're talking about is that you believe that people, if in certain circumstances, should have the right to take a gun and shoot at the government, whether that's shoot at the police or shoot at the military or shoot at. I mean, I would assume what you kind of like the real talk away from metaphor, like that's it. And I'm not, I want to be clear. You are not saying that that's what you think people should be doing right now. Do you think that just as part of that though, and I just want to explore that for a moment, does each individual American who owns a gun, is it up to them to determine when they think tyranny is there? Does there need to be a concentrated, we all get together and agree that this is tyranny? Like, does there need to be a podcast where everybody comes together and they say, all right, this is it, we're going to go shoot at people? Like, because obviously, in theory, what you're saying, and history, like you said, bears that out. But I also think that people kind of think sometimes that there's a day where everybody wakes up and they're like, that's it, that's tyranny right there. What do you think? And we don't have to go too deep into this because I don't think any of us has any plans of ever getting to this point. But like, what does tyranny look like to where this would be a solution that people would undertake? And would they? Is it up to each individual person to decide when that's tyranny, or how do you think, like, in what world would that look like in this hypothetical far off world that's far off from where we are? What would that look like?
Yeah, well, this would not be the podcast probably to incite that, but no, I don't think it's up to each individual person because there are people right now who think that the government is tyrannical, and I I would not want those people to start a revolution because we're not there. I think the Second Amendment is there to protect all the other amendments, and so when it comes to a point where uh, if it comes to a point where the government decides that they're going to throw out the rights of people, that they are going to essentially remove the republic part of our country, that's a time when we cross that bridge. That's when that conversation will happen. But no, I don't think it's up to just some random person to decide that today's the day that we're going to take up arms against the
Today,
government.
April 7th, 2018. Yeah, no.
Right.
Well, and but I mean, even that, we live in such an emotional and politically charged and just incendiary political climate. You can read the comments on any given Twitter post and see the things that people are saying. If there are some people who, like I was thinking this, that anybody who has an upside down American flag as their avatar on any given political website is probably not a person who has reasonable political views that I can understand. But if you were to ask that person who has said America is in distress, they would probably tell you tyranny is here. The republic is gone. So I mean, it's something to. I think that what you're talking about in theory makes sense, but in principle, you have to be very, very careful about it. And in my mind, I think that there has to be there has to be some sort of collective decision making when it comes to that. Like,
Right. And
when I say collective, I'm not just talking about a city. I'm talking about, like, there needs to be some sort of a more formal conversation, because otherwise you just are shooting at the government, and that's like that's sort of the catch-22 of all of this. Of like, is that the by nature something that sounds like liberty looks like shooting at the government, and I think it's just something to think about.
yeah.
Um, there was one more question I had for you, which was, when it comes to other countries who don't have the United States relationship with guns and with gun violence. When you look at other countries and other models where the individual gun ownership is much less strictly protected and much less valued, in your mind, do those countries are they doing it wrong? Do they need more guns? Are they ripe for the taking right now? Because they don't. I don't know I'm not trying to set you up on this. I just don't, like, when you look at a country that has more stringent gun laws and less gun ownership, like, would you look at that and say, oh, that's a weakness?
Well, certainly those countries have a different culture and a different background from us, and I think it's outside of just gun culture. I mean, our country was founded on this idea of these God-given rights, or these inherent rights, and that's what the idea is, that even if they're not written down in a document, we still have them. Other countries don't necessarily embrace that same kind of ideology. Um, but what I'll say is that those countries don't have the history of an incredible, and by that I mean significant, gun culture that we have here. For example, like in Australia, when they took those guns away, they didn't have already centuries of gun ownership, and so the American gun culture is different, and I would agree it's unhealthy in many ways. But that's when I get down to some of these ideas of whether it's just a assault weapons ban, or some people who would advocate for a complete gun ban. My big question is, how in the world do you propose about going about that? Because when you point to these other countries who have done it, or who have done similar things, or controlled guns in similar manners, you're not comparing apples to apples.
Yeah, I think that, and I think you hit upon the biggest reason why I would describe myself as not not one of those very anti-gun sort of people, despite not personally having guns intersect with my life very much. Is exactly what you say. There at this point, and the thing that I tell people when I talk about this issue is, there's no unringing that bell. Whether or not you think it's good that guns are everywhere, guns are everywhere in the United States. And I do have a certain amount of sympathy for the position that if you were to outlaw guns tomorrow, that the only people who would have guns, well, by definition, would be criminals, but would be people who would then have a disproportionate amount of power, because they are the only ones with guns. And I think that is unfortunate to me. If I were to hit the reset button on America, I would much rather live in a place where gun ownership wasn't as prevalent. I think in general, I read a really interesting article. I think it was Vox, but they were doing some research that was talking about how the nature of how a country achieves independence or revolution has a strong correlation with how it rules after the next government is settled. That is, that countries that are violent tend to have more violence after the new government is settled, whereas countries that have less violence tend to have less peaceful demonstrations or peaceful transitions of power tend to have more peaceful governments afterwards, and more of what we'd consider positive outcomes. Now, I'm not a scholar of the American Revolution and don't know enough to know what peaceful solutions were available back then. I have seen Hamilton, so I am a little bit of a scholar, but not enough to consider myself an expert. But in my mind, I wish that was the world that we live in, but we don't. In my mind, my view on this is that at this point, understanding that the gravity of the situation is two things. Number one, there are a lot of guns, and that's not going away. And number two, there are a lot of people who have a very, very passionate relationship with their guns. Our former President Obama once famously got dinged on the campaign trail for saying that people cling to guns and religion as an emergency vehicle goes outside my door. And there's my chihuahua howling. So we'll edit this out or welcome everybody to listening to my 8-pound dog howl at the ambulance. But the other part of that is that we're not going to be able to claw that back. And so the world, rather than being the world, can you hear him?
Not a lot. It's
okay, yeah, I can hear him a lot, and I don't know how much is picking up. That is my chihuahua. Okay, so let's go. I'm going to keep moving forward. The beauties of recording at home. My big feeling on this is that we're just not gonna be able to claw that back. So we got to figure out how are we going to make things safer. And we talked a little bit about the bump stock ban. I think that makes it. In my mind, one of the big abstractions that we talk about. We talk a lot about guns. We talk a lot about like the right to own things. And I think one of the core things that people need to understand as we talk about this is this simple idea. The more commonly available an instrument of death is, the more common death will be. Meaning, if there are 100 guns in America, there's not going to be very much gun violence. If there are 600 million guns in America, there's going to be more gun violence. And the more guns there are and the more dangerous those guns are, the more easily accessible it will be to kill people. Yes, you can get in a truck and go drive through a crowd of people and maybe kill a few of them very quickly. But if you have a bump stock and a high-powered rifle and you are sitting in a high vantage point, you can kill many, many people very, very quickly and not need to be especially skilled and not need to be put in any huge amount of danger if you're high enough. And that's sort of the danger of all of this. People there was a discussion of should we arm teachers? And again, like, the more guns that you put in a situation, the more yes, we all hope the gun is only ever pointed at a bad person. But there are a lot of times when it's not pointed at just a bad person. And I think that that's a danger and a thing that we should talk about. So I'm fully in favor. If somebody, in my mind, if you want a handgun for personal safety, thumbs up. That's great. I understand that. I think that's well within the Second Amendment rights. I think that's reasonable. If you want a hunting rifle to go hunt wild boar or whatever it is that you are hunting, I have lots of family who went hunting. That's fine. I don't think anybody wants to take away your hunting rifle. I think in very limited amounts, if there are, if you want to go to a shooting range and at the shooting range they have some sort of a more high-powered weapon, I think that's a little bit more on the borderline. But if it is not a weapon that has a purpose that is extended to your own personal safety, I don't think there's any reason why it should exist. I don't think that there's a reason why anybody should own a weapon that is capable of firing dozens of rounds in a matter of seconds. I don't think that the boar needs to be hit with that. I don't think that serves any legitimate purpose besides the murdering many human beings very quickly. And if the only reason why something exists is to murder a bunch of human beings very quickly, I don't think people should have it. And that extends to things like rocket launchers and nuclear weapons and chemical weapons. I don't think people should have those things either, because all that those do is have the ability to kill a lot of people very quickly. So that I don't think we're that far away on this. We never get. I don't feel like we're ever super far away. Uh,
Well, I mean, first of all, you're coming after my nuclear weapons, and I'm not a big fan of that.
Boy, this is hello FBI. I would just like to say Steven is saying all of the bad things today.
Yeah. Anyways, well, I mean, you look at some actually practical uses for an AR-15. You talk about wild boars. There's hunters that use that for a wild boar, and some of those hunters with the infestation of wild boars have to do it from a helicopter, and it kind of sounds like a very fun job. But I mean, there are applications other than just killing people, which I would agree is probably the primary purpose that they're used for, though.
And nuclear
But
weapons can be used to mow your lawn if you're in a pinch, but that doesn't mean that that's how they should be used.
correct, yes, yeah, yeah. But what I'm getting at is that there are the vast majority of people use in the I mean the vast majority of people who own an AR-15 are not killing people with it. They have no intention of killing people with it.
Sure, and I think that's probably true. I don't think that in saying that if you own an AR-15 that it is your intention to do that. And you may very well be right that there are some legitimate uses for that. But again, like if somebody came up with legitimate uses for sarin gas or whatever, I also would be uncomfortable with lots of people having that. Like, and I guess it's a matter of, like there's always this balance between sort of like liberty and safety, right? Look, maybe then especially for something like an AR-15, I think that would be. And I should be clear, I am one of those people who, when it comes to what is an assault rifle, people like to use assault rifle to mean anything big and scary that
Yeah.
shoots bullets. And I don't know. I will admit to not knowing a lot about. And when people say assault rifle ban, I'm careful of that just because I don't know enough about that. I want to back good policy that actually does what I want it to do and not just what it sounds like I want it to do. But I would think that for something, the more dangerous a weapon is, the more strict the licensing should be to have access to it. Just the same way of, if you want to go get a dump truck full of concrete, you can't just go get one of those. Like you've got to go through. My uncle used to be a truck driver who drove around nuclear waste. You can't just find somebody on the side of the road who does that. And in my mind, if an AR-15 has a legitimate purpose, then great. Then there should be a licensing process that everybody has to go through to get that, because the more dangerous something is, the more careful we should be about who gets that. We do that with cars. Cars are dangerous, and we make sure that you have to go get a license before you drive one so you don't hurt people. I think that something that is most explicitly tied to destruction should have even more strict licensing requirements. But you're right. If there are legitimate uses for it, then I can support that.
So, so I think that's the biggest challenge that I have when people advocate for um, a ban or a limitation on the actual weapons themselves is um, everyone who's come out after Parkland is unable to specifically and technically identify what they mean by assault weapon. They just say, well, it's painted black and it looks like something the military uses, and so it's an assault weapon. Everything by definition is an assault weapon. Um, and so that's kind of my biggest challenge with it, is that no one is offering an actual common sense definition of what they would consider assault weapons. So it's that very fine line that we're now having to walk with things. I mean, obviously we can say, yeah, nuclear weapons or a grenade launcher or a fully automatic machine gun is something that people shouldn't have. But then as we get down closer into semi-automatic weapons and an AR-15 or whatever people mean by an assault weapon, that's where it becomes a lot more dicey because those
Yeah.
definitions aren't clear.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And I think that clear definitions are important. And I think that policy should be guided by thought and rationality as opposed to just what I think about a weapon. In my mind, my very amateur view is it's regardless of the mechanics of the gun, it's how much I've been playing a lot of Fortnite lately. This is so. Let me go ahead and draw on my Fortnite experience to inform my gun control views. There's a certain amount in Fortnite. There's this thing among the Fortnite community called damage per second, of basically how much damage can something deal how quickly. And I think that that should be a lot more of what the conversation is about. I don't, without knowing the mechanics of an actual, of a semi-automatic versus not. I mean, I know in spirit like what those things mean, but in my mind, it's again how much damage can something do, how quickly, and the more damage it can do more quickly, the more strict the licensing should be. And in my mind, the result should be more effect based than necessarily like the mechanics of, well, that's an assault rifle and that's this. In my mind, it's much more of how fast and how deadly does it make it. And those are the sorts of things that I think should be using our guide for maintaining policy, as opposed to just what kind of gun it is, because you can make modifications to guns that make them more deadly and make very easy things that kind of change that. And those are the things that in my mind we should be regulating, as opposed to just what kind of gun is it. I
And
mean, go ahead.
I think that's a more realistic approach to it. And if there was actually a politician who was able to come out and kind of say what you said, I think there would generally be more support around it. One of the ways they've tried to do that is to say we're going to limit the magazine capacity. But then you get into, people say that anything above 12 rounds is high capacity. I have a handgun that holds 12 rounds, and that's hardly high capacity. As if the argument that the time it takes to reload would minimize damage, which it's not a musket, so it doesn't take 5 minutes to reload. So I think you're along the right tracks, but even people who have tried to go down the road of whether it's magazine limitations or banning some of those accessories that make something more deadly, they still fall short. And I guess that's my biggest frustration is that, and I texted you this after, I think during the town hall that CNN did, we're not having a sober discussion about this. And I guess now that we're a little more removed, a couple more weeks removed from the situation, it's getting a little more sober, albeit it's fading. But I don't think it's possible to have a sober discussion about these issues because it only comes up after a mass shooting happens. And whenever you're in fear and whenever something tragic has happened, that's, in my mind, that's not when you should legislate something. Now, that's not to say that legislation shouldn't happen or that we shouldn't have the discussion. It's just very hard to do it in a logical way.
Yeah.
And so many people jump to just do this, do that, without thinking through the mechanics of what specifically they want.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of leads into what we were talking about before about Parkland and about, should we be taking, how much of our cue should we be taking from 17-year-old kids that just survived a traumatic experience? And somebody mentioned this on, I saw a tweet about it, where somebody was saying, why are we talking about gun control instead of, like any one of the other issues that are very pressing? And I think that somebody responded, well, that's where the heat is right now. That's where the political gravity is. And I think that, it ties back to the whole purpose of the show. Is one of the problems that we have is that if something isn't scary or in your face or immediately threatening you, that we can't draw people's attention to it enough. There's not enough eyeballs to be able to get everybody collectively talking about something in a way that can force action. And so it's sort of this catch-22 of simultaneously the thing that you need to get everybody's attention directed at an issue is also the thing that makes people less reasonable and be able to talk about things in sort of a less clear-headed way. And to be clear, I'm not saying that anybody in the Parkland show. I've been super inspired by the Parkland kids, like the kids who have come forward and said, and that's just the people who agree, but also the people who don't. It is just, I know a lot of 17. We both work with 17-year-old kids, and it is astounding that anybody can, in that moment of so much pressure, can step forward and say something in an eloquent way that gets people's attention. And I think it's worth listening to, even if you don't listen to each of the specific policy prescriptions. I think ultimately, and you and I are both sort of like, we have a respect for policy, because good policy is very sober-minded and is very analytical, and good policy is a thinking mechanism that serves an emotional end. And I think that too many people think that you can insert emotion into the policy making part, and you end up just with bad policy. I mean, I always give the example of rent control. As a more liberal guy, a lot of progressive people really like rent control, and it's like, what you are wanting emotionally is for it to be more affordable for people to live places, but you're inserting emotion into the policy and actually counterintuitively making it more expensive for people to live places. So I think that people should have a conversation a lot more about, what, like you said, what are the sober-minded thinking policies that need to be enacted to achieve the emotional ends. And I think people sometimes mix those two up, or just want to jam all the emotions into the policy making, and emotion doesn't make for good policy. It makes for great theory behind the policy, and you can't be good politicians without, or even good humans without being emotional, but it just doesn't make for good rules. Rules aren't made well when it is an emotional process, because they are going to be applied in dispassionate ways. So I don't know. Any more thoughts you have on that?
Well, I think you make a good point about the emotion of it, and the negative side of it is that emotion makes great television, and so after these situations, you have commentators and policy people who go on and try to advocate things from the emotional point of view, and it opens up kind of that Overton window of uh, uh, actually shifting things either further left or further right, and you end up with bad policy because that policy is the result of the emotion. So I think that's important, and also, the kids. I think there's that line between the kids are great in terms of advocating for the idea that they don't want to die, which is a uh, very important thing for them to say. It's unfortunate that kids have to say that now, but important. And then the policy should be left to the lawmakers. And I don't think any reasonable person is looking to the kids to come up with policy solutions. I think the kids are most effective in staying on top of lawmakers, and making sure that something actually gets done. The good news is that some things have already gotten done. The Safe Schools Act was passed, in part because of advocacy from the Parkland kids, and specifically Kyle Kashuv is one of them. He's one of the more conservative students, but he went and visited all these congressional leaders and the president, and so some policy did actually come out of that, which is encouraging, and hopefully that trend continues.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that in general, young people, if you are listening to this, if you care about something, clearly people are waiting for energy and enthusiasm around it. And we learn this when we go help young people lobby in DC. People love young people, and it's because you make great optics and you've got great energy, and nobody wants to be anti-kid. So if you are a young person, go, and you're passionate about an issue, organize and go talk to lawmakers about it. Again, you don't necessarily need to know all the policy answers, but being able to talk about the principles and the vision and the emotion is, I think, very powerful and moving, and something that we need, because there's a lot of the hardest thing in politics right now is, I think, directing everybody's attention to something, and then also not having it just be an anger. I think that's the hard part. And if you can solve that, you will be a very influential, powerful person.
I'm curious about your thoughts on another side of this coin that often gets brought up,
Sure.
which is the idea of mental health.
Ah,
And after every shooting, the go-to talking point is, we may have a gun problem in this country, but the bigger problem is mental health. Now, I agree with this point. Obviously, we have a mental health um, issue. Just about everybody is affected in some way by some sort of mental health challenge, whether it be minor or major. But what I've often been critical of my fellow conservatives and Republicans for doing is saying we need more mental health resources. We need to address the mental health crisis in this country. And then they go and cut funding for mental health programs. They never address the need for mental health resources. And that just becomes their very simple fallback for
Yeah.
not doing anything.
Yeah, it's
So
a
I'm curious your
scapegoat.
thoughts.
It's a
Yeah.
scapegoat. It is the first thing you say is thoughts and prayers, and then the second thing you say is we have a mental health problem in this country. Because the wonderful part about saying mental health is it means that you don't have to talk about guns. But I do think that I think this is a pretty easy thing. I think that mental health is an issue. I think that and there needs to be more treatment for it. Again, there's not very much heat around that issue, which is amazing for as much as because people aren't serious about it when they say it. Nobody is actually proposing anything related to mental health. What mental health investment would actually look like is, and I say this as somebody whose fiance has gone through an eating disorder over the last 2 years, and who's coincidentally seen a lot of very depressed people dealing with a lot of mental illness, trauma responses, a lot of people who are sort of hurting themselves. And are in danger of psychotic episodes. Not all people with eating disorders are, but there are a lot of people who have a lot of intersections with a lot of other bipolar and a lot of other trauma responses. And the amount of crap that you have to go through to get treated for mental health in this country and do it in an affordable way is absurd. In my mind, if there was a one policy that tomorrow would be able to actually help address a lot of these mental health issues, it's that and this is my hippie liberal, but like, there needs to be some, you need mental health access needs to be available to everyone. It needs to be affordable to everyone. It needs to be, and when I say affordable to everyone, if you can't afford it, you still need to be able to get it, because mental health, even more than physical health, mental health is such a danger to everyone. And when I say such a danger, I'm not saying that if you are mentally ill that you are a danger to those around you. I am just saying that mentally ill people, we see this all the time, are more inclined at times to be able to reach out violently or to do things with other folks. And that intersects with alcoholism, that intersects with anger management. I mean, there's a lot of mental health stuff that people struggle with. People need to be able to access it. It needs to be affordable. It cannot be, and this is the biggest thing for me, it cannot run through an insurance company. My health insurance, when it comes to whether a doctor, when I break my arm, that's very cut and dry, but it is so easy for insurance companies to deny claims because they don't want to cover mental illness. And that is the biggest problem behind all of this. And we could do another whole episode on mental illness and treatment, but if anybody was actually serious about treating it, it would be affordable to everybody. It would be available to everyone, and it would be at a doctor's discretion whether it would continue, not in insurance companies. That is my sort of like elevator pitch 2-minute view on it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would actually agree with you on that one, just because I think in many ways, if you take care of the mental health challenges, you'll help avoid physical health challenges and other kind of health challenges. So, but my biggest frustration with this is when people on my own side or on any side say that this is the problem. A, it's not the only problem, but B, then actually do something about it. And especially kids, right? Like, it's affecting kids more than anyone else. And it shouldn't be. Like, that should not be the junior high school. Yeah, you go through a lot, but that should not be the age where kids are becoming so depressed or so anxious that they end up acting out violently. And so we should be able to avoid that as early as possible. So I just wanted to bring that up because it's something that is often said, but not addressed, because it's not as I guess sexy of an issue.
Yeah, well, you can't, because it's not a big scary gun. It's an issue that takes a lot more nuance. I mean, we saw that with the Affordable Care Act, and people hated it just because there's a lot of reasons you could like or love it, but there are a lot of people who just disliked it because it was healthcare and government in the same conversation. I mean, I feel like that's the same thing of when people say support the troops and then want to, take away funding from the VA hospital. There's a lot of this stuff. It's like you can be a person who has conservative views, but back them up in policy too. Liberal people do this. Well, liberal people probably would do this more if they had any power in America. But but as it stands, it's like 14 state houses and no branches of government. Like it would be interesting to say. I'm sure that liberal folks would suffer from the same thing if given, total control over as much things as conservative folks have control over right now. And certainly, I think liberal folks too can kind of are more susceptible in my mind, in my own personal experience, of falling into the desire to want to make policies emotionally that don't necessarily, again, rent control, San Francisco, there's a lot of times that I think that good intentions kind of fall short. But yeah, in my mind, I think we have to get comfortable with the fact that some of these issues are only going to be solved together. And the best way to solve them together is to have a clear policy and a clear system that can address it. Go ahead.
The biggest thing that I would say to that is when it comes to the gun debate, really any debate, but especially the gun debate, because you're talking about trying to keep people from being killed. There is often this notion that either one side wants to take your fundamental rights away, and that is their primary motivation, and then the other side is perfectly okay with the murdering of children.
Yeah.
And I think in order for this to be a positive and productive conversation, you have to be able to say, no, one side just wants to address violence and the other side is skeptical of government regulating rights, or you have to be able to address it from the standpoint of they're not evil.
Yeah.
Either side is not evil. We just have a different background with it, because a lot of people are probably in your similar position of haven't necessarily shot a gun or wasn't raised with that. And so being able to recognize that and having a conversation around it is more important than just kind of painting this monolithic picture of each side and basing everything off of that.
Yeah, and I think what you said is there's so much. If anybody is yelling about the extreme, they're probably pretty extreme themselves. I think that in general, and that's why I like doing this podcast, this, whatever you want to call this thing we do, because I think that, yeah, I mean, it is possible to have reasonable conversations about this stuff, and it's possible to be sober-minded and to try to find some sort of balance between those things, because you're right, because anger is such a motivating factor, and you talk about the Overton window, everybody's trying to move the window as far their direction as possible, because compromise doesn't really exist. There's people don't come together to try to find middle ground. They're running away from each other. It's almost like a reverse, I guess, just a tug of war. And so you're, almost the people who, it's like the NRA. Like the NRA is a very, very it goes almost to PETA lengths, I think, sometimes of extremism in their views. But it's again to protect that Overton window of it feels like if I give a little, then then a mile will be given. But I think it is possible to have a reasonable conversation about this stuff, and I think it's possible to have reasonable policies that people can agree with. And even if you don't agree with it, that you can feel like this is that you can still look at the policy and be like, well, that's not tyranny. I may not agree with that policy. I might think it's dumb, but they're not coming to take all my guns, or they don't want children to be murdered, or whatever it happens to be. Anything else that you got, Stephen?
It would just say that I have not been paid by the NRA, so I just want to put that out there.
Me neither. In case anybody is wondering, they haven't reached out. I'm still waiting on my check.
They've offered me a sticker, but it's not really something I want. So,
but
no, this was good.
Yeah, this has been episode 4. Whether or not we're going to break it into 2. We talked about whether we're going to break it into 2 episodes, break it into 1, because we talked way longer than the 20 minutes that we wanted to, but it was a good conversation. If you have thoughts about whether or not we should do 4 or whether or not we should do this future episodes that are an hour long and split them in 2 or do them all in 1, let us know. We are on Twitter at Positive Polls, POLS, which drives me crazy that we can't have at Make Politics Positive.
Wow.
because it's too many letters because the man's trying to take away our letters. You can also send us an email at makepoliticspositive@gmail.com. I am at teamtry_Curtis. Stephen, you are?
At Stephen_Perkins.
So reach out to us if you hate what we said, if you think that it's an atrocity, if you have a search warrant to execute against us, you can send it via email. Stephen, anything else you'd like to say to the good people?
No, other than I appreciate the support during the lapse in our videos. So
Our long hike,
hiatus.
our hiatus? I prefer to think of it as a hike along the Appalachian Trail, just an extended hike.
But none of that, you have to be careful with that because people will assume things.
That is true. That is true. I wonder where Mark Sanford is now. I want to know that. That's my next Google after this.
Probably living his best life.
Probably. All right. So 2 weeks from now, we'll pick a new issue and we'll dive into it, and we'll see what more issues that Stephen and I can solve together. You're welcome, America. Have a great day.